Hello, welcome to Cherry Red TV. My name is Iain McNay, and today we have another programme in the series about independent labels in the UK. And today it's about RPM Records, and I'm joined by RPM co-founder and current managing director, Mark Stratford. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Iain.
And we're going to talk about RPM, which stands for Revolutions Per Minute.
It does. It's the name came about because we wanted something similar to CBS EMI, a three-letter name that was very easy to remember.
So you're trying to sound like a big boy right from day one.
Absolutely,
yeah?
Most definitely. And it was one of the other founders, I think it was Simon Robinson, that came up with simply, well, if you look at any piece of vinyl, it's got RPM on there, and it just fell into place, yes. At the same time, you could say, well, you know, we're driving forward in the field of reissues, so this is revolutionary. But I don't think that was the case, really. It just sounded good. And also, you know, as you do with these things, you kind of look around to see, you know, does it sound like anybody else's label, anybody else using that name? And we only found at that time, I think, there was a 50s R&B label which the Bahari brothers had run, and there was a 70s sort of disco label in South Africa. So we felt with that sort of competition we were probably safe. So we continue with RPM, and actually today there are a few other companies called RPM, but in the field of record labels, it still seems to be the only one. Yeah. And yet you'd think it was almost the most obvious name to choose, because it's what every record has. It spins round and round. Absolutely. In revolutions per minute.
So you started in 1991.
Yes. And
you had two partners. You mentioned Simon Robinson.
Yeah, Simon Robinson and Roger Dobson was the other partner, and we had worked together a couple of times when I was at the Connoisseur Collection, which was a catalogue label. This was the end of the 80s, early 90s. Yeah. Owned by Steve Mason and John Craig, and I was a product manager there and putting releases together. And I'd used Simon for artwork purposes and Roger writing sleeve notes, but we'd also discussed ideas, sort of A&R ideas. And so, for example, Simon is an expert on Deep Purple. He's known the band for years and the management, and we worked together on a couple of projects there, some Purple stuff and Rainbow, and then with Roger, a generation older than me, had been there in the 60s, and he'd got lots of knowledge and information from that time of the right sort of things that people might be interested in. So we put a couple of early releases together at Connoisseur using Roger and Simon, and that's how we got together, and then there came a point when we decided, actually, we'd quite like to do a label ourselves. Connoisseur was fine.
It's quite a brave step, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Putting yourself on the line, it's all very well. You work for someone else and you get paid a fee or retainer, whatever. But to do it yourself, you take the risk.
In my case, it could have been very foolhardy, because we started it in '91, and sort of within a couple of months, I discovered that my wife was pregnant with twins. So I went freelance, keeping some companies on a consultancy basis, but basically, had taken away that regular wage in favour of, let's start my own thing. And at that time, my overheads were about to be tripled.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So perhaps it was a bit of a brave thing, but it seemed the right thing to do at the time. And at that time, for the world of reissues, there were people before us, but we felt there were lots of projects that hadn't been touched, and that collectively we could bring these together.
But let's just go back just briefly. So you started it in your late 20s.
Yes, yeah.
And it's interesting that you were already at that point into kind of historical music, let's say, into catalogue music.
Yeah.
Then you didn't want to start a label that had contemporary bands.
I dabbled. I'd managed a band in the 80s called the Cylons, and so I'd kind of had a look at that, and we got as far as a couple of Radio 1 sessions, and John Peel naming their only mini album, he called it Cylons is Golden, and that had got so far and then not really taken off. But at the same time, I'd always looked at, or always been interested in music that wasn't necessarily governed by Radio 1 and the charts. And there had been, all the way along, some good radio shows that played alternative music. Not what alternative music means today, but back in the 70s, when you had Stuart Coleman playing rock and roll shows on a Saturday and Alexis Corner on a Sunday playing his R&B, that was like the alternative. I know to your ears, punk was where it was at, but for me, it was R&B and
I understand.
and rock and roll. And I used to go to I'd go to the Marquee and see the blues band at the time that others might see, new wave bands. And that was kind of what I was interested in at that time. And then through the 80s, I got to work for distributors, and one in particular, Making Waves, who were the people that distributed all the specialist labels. So Rounder Records from the States, which had all the American folk material and country material, and Yazoo, which had a lot of blues. Plus, so we had all the specialist kind of music, but plus they distributed Demon and Ace, who were starting to build their catalogues for 60s, 70s, reissues. Yeah. And so it was kind of from there I started to get into, wider catalogues of music from different periods, different decades. So some of the influence came from radio, and some of it came from actually selling, some early reissue products.
Anyway, so you kind of decided to start a label with your partners. Yeah. So how did you decide on your first releases?
The first releases were what we had to hand in a way, and I have to put my hand up. The first three were Sandy Shaw Reviewing the Situation, the Q-Tips live album, and Joe Meek, I Hear a New World. And I do put my hand up to the Q-Tips. That was...
But they're very different.
That was my fault. I don't think we've ever put anything else out like the Q-Tips.
Well, it was Paul Young's band, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It was just not the right thing for RPM. But I represented it at that time, and I'd licensed tracks out for other compilations. I kind of worked it, so it was just there. Yeah. So we put it in. Whereas actually Simon and Roger had got absolutely the right idea. Simon had been a fan of Sandy Shaw for years, and this was one album from '69 at the end of her sort of peak period. Very interesting album, and where she got to record the things that she wanted to record, not what she was told to record. And then the legendary "I Hear a New World," which from Joe Meek, which Roger had known about for years, and more importantly had known where there was a sound source. He knew who the rights had reverted to, and he knew who had a sound source, because it's a very rare album. So really those two were the way we started. Those two albums were kind of set out the definition of what RPM should be.
The Joe Meek one is actually quite a groundbreaking album, wasn't it? Because it was, when it came out originally, it was regarded as a very weird product.
Yeah, very much ahead of its time, I suppose, in terms of what Joe Meek had put onto that record. Only perhaps Delia Derbyshire was doing anything similar, and that was for the Radiophonic Workshop. So very experimental, but has since, it's taken on another lease of life of people saying, well, this is a pioneering record, it's very out there, because at the time it was nothing like the pop records of the time. Yeah. But has a lot of influence, or had a lot of influence on what came after. So, yeah, big record really.